The village of High Marchbank had a talent for being picturesque. It lay in a fold of green downs like a postcard someone had forgotten to put away. All tiled roofs and whitewashed cottages, with hollyhocks leaning conspiratorially over low stone walls. On that particular September afternoon, it surpassed even itself. Bunting flapped lazily above the green. The brass band from much Chillingford puffed out "Rule Britannia" with wheezy determination. And the annual harvest fete of St. Luke's. Church was in full and complacent swing. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry at the Grange, had been declared too useful to waste indoors, and stationed with knitting and sun hat near the jam stall. From there, she could see most of the proceedings without the inconvenience of moving more than was strictly necessary. "It's all become terribly organized since your day, Jane," Dolly Bantry announced, fanning herself with a program and blocking the path of two small boys in cowboy hats. "Committees. We never had committees. One asked people, and they did as they were told. Much simpler." Miss Marple smiled vaguely and counted stitches. A young woman passed them, cheeks flushed, arms piled with hymn books. This was Miss Lydia Carlton, newly arrived in the village, and, it was widely agreed, too pretty to be sensible. "I only hope the poor child hasn't taken on more than she can manage," Miss Marple murmured. Dolly snorted. "Taken on? She thrives on it. Treasurer of the Fete Committee, assistant to the vicar's wife, organizer of the flower rota, and engaged to that dull young doctor. What's his name? Oh yes, Dr. Peter Lennox. No, Lydia can manage just about anything, except perhaps a quiet life." It was, in fact, Lydia Carlton's day. Her accounts had balanced to the penny. The tombola tickets were selling briskly, and the vicar's opening prayer had singled her out by name. Even the older ladies, who regarded efficiency in the young with deep suspicion, had condescended to approve. Lydia set the hymn books on a trestle table beside the tea urn, pushed a wisp of hair back under her hat, and glanced at her wristwatch. 4 o'clock? The judging of the produce would be announced, followed by the auction, and finally the drawing of the grand raffle. She felt a glow of satisfaction. Too time. "Lydia, dear, you haven't by any chance seen the rector?" asked Mrs. Angela Fairweather, the vicar's wife, materializing with a worried expression and a trail of pins still clinging to her cardigan. "He was to fetch the diary." "The diary?" Lydia repeated. "Yes, the old parish diary. The great big one. The bishop insisted it be displayed, you know. Our living record of village life." Mrs. Fairweather's tone suggested that the bishop's enthusiasms were a burden borne heroically. "It's in the vestry safe, or it ought to be. He said he'd bring it out after the judging." Lydia shook her head. "I haven't seen him for the last half hour. Perhaps he's with Inspector Lake." "Dear me, I hope not," Mrs. Fairweather said vaguely. "Every time they talk, something expensive seems to happen to the gutters." Miss Marple, who had excellent hearing for certain kinds of remark, allowed herself a tiny, private smile. The announcement for the produce prizes came and went, accompanied by applause and a muffled quarrel over the second-best marrows. The rector did not appear, nor did the vaunted parish diary, which had been spoken of for weeks. 500 closely written pages in a monstrous leather binding, charting births, deaths, quarrels, reconciliations, subscriptions to missionary societies, and, if village legend were to be believed, 1 or 2 matters much better left unrecorded. It was 15 minutes later, during the bustle of moving tables for the auction, that Lydia went herself to look for the rector. She never reached the vestry. Dr. Lennox, summoned by a shrill cry from one of the choir boys, reached the body first. The rector of High Marchbank lay in the narrow corridor behind the church, beneath a high lancet window, his spectacles broken beside him and one hand flung out as though still in protest. His head rested in a dark, spreading stain. The great parish diary lay open on the flagstones a little way off, one page torn jaggedly down the middle. Miss Marple, who arrived a moment later with Dolly Bantry and half the village at her heels, did not attempt to go closer. She stood very still, her blue eyes traveling not to the blood or to the broken glasses, but to Lydia Carleton, white-faced, clutching the door frame, and to the torn page of the diary, fluttering faintly in the draught. Then she glanced up at the high, uncurtained window and the dim, cobwebbed ledge just beneath it. "It's so very curious," she said mildly, to no one in particular. "People do not usually take a heavy volume like that for a walk." For a moment the scene held a curious stillness, as though the village itself were drawing breath. Then sound crashed back upon the vicarage lawn. In a confused babble of voices, exclamations, and the shrill hysteria of one or two ladies who considered that a fainting fit was the proper tribute to tragedy. "Keep back, please! Keep back!" Dr. Haydock called sharply, kneeling beside Miss Blacklock's body. "There's nothing to be done. Someone fetch Inspector Craddock at once. And nobody, I repeat nobody, is to touch that diary." His last instruction was quite futile, Miss Marple knew. Not that anyone would actually lay a hand on the thing while it lay so dangerously exposed, but every eye was already upon it, darting, curious, desperate. The mere existence of those 500 pages had turned the entire company into potential culprits or victims of exposure, if not of poison. Colonel Bantry, all at once conscious of his responsibilities as a magistrate and landowner, puffed himself up and began shepherding people away in clumsy semicircles. "Now then, move along, please. Nothing more to be done here. Vicar, perhaps you could say a word, in your professional capacity." The vicar, looking as though he had been asked to extemporize over the day of judgment, muttered something about the uncertainty of life and the necessity of Christian charity, which nobody listened to, because Mrs. Hargreaves had just announced in a carrying whisper that she had always said Letitia would come to a bad end, the way she poked about in other people's affairs. "Poison," murmured Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple as they rose from their seats. "And in the lemonade, too. It might have been anyone, Jane. Anyone at all." "Not quite anyone," Miss Marple said mildly, settling her shawl. "One does not, as a rule, go about poisoning lemonade on the off chance that some undesired person will happen to drink it. No, my dear Dolly, this is much more particular." Her gaze traveled slowly over the dispersing crowd. There was Mrs. Hargreaves, lips pursed with vindicated spite. Young Susan Price from the post office, plainly frightened, almost tearful. Mr. Lionel Godfrey, the new schoolmaster, standing very stiff and white, as though all this was an outrage to his carefully ordered world. And there, half concealed behind the jam store, was Mrs. Ellerton, the vicar's wife, staring not at the body but at the fallen diary with a look that was very near dread. "Curious," Miss Marple remarked, almost to herself. "What is?" asked Mrs. Bantry promptly. "How people look when they suddenly remember something," Miss Marple replied. "It is rather as if an old letter, long forgotten at the back of a drawer, had been thrust under their nose, and they were obliged to read it." Inspector Craddock arrived with commendable speed, his car crunching over the gravel drive. He was a solid, capable man, with that particular expression of professional resignation which suggests that murders are inconvenient, but must, one supposes, be dealt with. He doffed his hat to Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry as he passed. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, I might have known you'd both be at the very center of things." "Not by choice, I assure you," Mrs. Bantry retorted crisply. "We were having a perfectly peaceful afternoon until someone started putting cyanide in the refreshments." Craddock's eyes flicked to the broken glass, then to the body, then to the leather-bound book lying open on the grass. He frowned. "Is that the diary she was always talking about?" "It would appear so," Miss Marple said. "I understand it contains a very complete account of village affairs." "Does it indeed?" said Craddock slowly. In that case, it may very well contain the reason someone has just killed Miss Blacklock. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, then were still. Or, she said gently, it may be that the reason lies not in what is written there, Inspector, but in what someone was very much afraid she might be about to write next. Inspector Craddock followed Miss Marple's gaze toward the trampled grass and the cake stall, but the footprint had already been smudged by anxious feet in the clumsy passage of a constable. If he noticed her brief, intent look, he said nothing, merely instructed the sergeant to begin taking names and addresses. By early evening, the fate resembled the aftermath of some minor skirmish. The bunting still fluttered determinedly, the cakes sagged on their stands. But the laughter and chatter had given way to subdued murmurs. People were released one by one after giving their statements, though few went straight home. Instead, they clustered in little knots along the vicarage path and at the gate, their voices dropping to scandalized whispers as each new snippet of information emerged. Miss Marple, having been politely but firmly asked to remain until the inspector had spoken with her, sat quietly on a folding chair just inside the vicarage drawing room. A cup of tea cooling untouched on the table beside her. The door stood slightly ajar, and village voices drifted in from the hallway. Poison, they say, in her very gloss. Chosen specially. Oh, it makes me shudder. And that diary, 500 pages. She wrote about everyone, they say. Everyone. Imagine if she had something on you. Well, if people behave properly, they've nothing to fear, Mrs. Price Ridley declared loudly, and Miss Marple's thin lips twitched. In her experience, those who proclaimed their innocence most vociferously were often the ones with the most to hide. Inspector Craddock entered at last, holding a notebook rather than the heavy diary which had already been sent to the station. He took off his hat and sat opposite Miss Marple, regarding her with a mixture of professional respect and weary resignation. "I suppose you've noticed half a dozen things I haven't," he began without preamble. "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "Only people. I have always found people very instructive." He consulted his notes. Letitia Blacklock, age 62, unmarried, long-time resident, secretary of every committee ever invented, no close family that we know of. According to the vicar, she'd been pouring herself into that diary for over a year. Says she believed it her duty to posterity to set down the truth about village life. That's the sort of duty that makes enemies. "I dare say it does," Miss Marple agreed. "Truth, in my experience, is a dangerous commodity. People like it in principle, but very few enjoy it in practice. Dorette, Haydock confirms cyanide, administered in lethal quantity to her glass alone. No one else's drink was tampered with, which means someone had both opportunity and knowledge." He tapped his notebook. "We've got 3 obvious avenues. First, someone feared exposure in this diary. Second, some grudge entirely unconnected with the diary. Third, suicide, staged to resemble murder. Though I must say her speech about truth rather argues against that." Miss Marple considered. "Suicide would be tidy, of course, but Miss Blacklock did not strike me as a woman who would leave matters unfinished. That diary was an ongoing work, I think. She meant to add more. Besides, people who kill themselves seldom choose so public and theatrical an occasion." Craddock sighed. "I thought as much. Very well. Let's assume murder for now. You saw her with the diary earlier?" "Oh, yes. She hugged it, if one may use such a word, like a rather unattractive baby. And before she drank?" Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. She seemed resolved, like someone about to post a very important letter. "In other words, she was about to do something irrevocable," Craddock said, "and someone decided she mustn't." Outside, voices rose again, more heated now. "I tell you," someone hissed, "if she wrote down what I think she did—" Miss Marple glanced toward the door. "You will find, Inspector, that your problem is not a lack of suspects, but an embarrassment of them." "Yes," Craddock said grimly. And until we know exactly what was in that diary, we won't know which of them had most to lose. Jeremy Potts entered the study as one might approach a dentist's chair, resigned, uncomfortable, and hoping vaguely for a reprieve that would not come. From her seat in the drawing room, Miss Marple could not hear his words, but she watched his narrow shoulders hunched defensively, the way his hands twisted his cap in a continuous rhythm of anxiety. When he emerged 10 minutes later, he avoided everyone's eyes, heading straight for the sideboard where the untouched sandwiches lay wilting. "Guilt," Mrs. Hargreaves pronounced in a loud whisper to Mrs. Bantry. "Plain as day, that boy's never looked right to me. Shifty." Miss Marple, who had seen truly guilty men eat heartily and innocent ones go quite faint, reserved her judgment. Jeremy might well be frightened. There were many reasons a young man in service to half the village might dread talking to the police. Knowledge, she reflected, could be almost as dangerous as action. The second interview proved more illuminating to the onlookers. Craddock summoned Mrs. Hargreaves herself, and the woman's attempt at dignified composure slipped noticeably as she made her way to the study, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. When she returned, her face was pinched and tight, lips pressed together as though holding back words. Or perhaps, Miss Marple thought shrewdly, names? What did he want to know? Mrs. Bantry asked with open curiosity. Utterly routine, Mrs. Hargreaves replied crisply. Who was where, who spoke to whom, that sort of thing. Naturally, I could give him a clear account. Unlike some people, I don't spend village events skulking in corners. Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward the vicar's niece, Sylvia, who flushed but said nothing. Sylvia's hands, Miss Marple noticed, were perfectly steady as she refolded her handkerchief. It was only when Inspector Craddock emerged carrying Miss Blacklock's massive diary that the atmosphere in the room truly shifted. He laid the volume on a side table with noticeable effort. It landed with a thump that seemed to reverberate through every watching heart. "I've skimmed only the last few pages," he announced. "It appears Miss Blacklock was indeed setting the record straight. There's a detailed account of a certain incident from 20 years ago. A child, an inheritance dispute, a missing will." The reaction was instantaneous and varied. Miss Hargreaves gasped sharply, one hand flying to her throat. Colonel Bantry frowned deeply, as though trying to remember something half-forgotten. The vicar looked stricken. Sylvia's eyes widened, not in confusion, that would have been natural, but in something very like recognition. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting momentarily forgotten. A child and a missing will. Yes, that would provide sufficient motive for both anger and fear, particularly if the outcome of that dispute had shaped the comfortable lives so many now enjoyed. Miss Blacklock, Craddock continued, believed that a grave injustice had been done. She refers to the wrong heir having received a considerable sum, and to the true child being cast off and— He broke off, frowning. Curiously, the entry stops there, mid-sentence. The next page is blank, and the following ones resume with trivial domestic observations. Recipes, the vicarage roof repairs. Mrs. Price Ridley's new hair. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. How very interesting. People rarely interrupt themselves in the middle of righteous indignation, in my experience. Unless they are interrupted by someone else. Are you implying, Craddock asked, that someone might have tampered with the diary before we sealed it, or persuaded Miss Blacklock quite strongly to change her mind about recording certain details? Miss Marple replied mildly. The blank pages are particularly suggestive, like a silence inserted into a conversation just where it becomes most revealing. The remark seemed to fall especially heavily on Sylvia. Her fingers, so steady before, now tightened convulsively around her handkerchief. Miss Marple noted, too, how Mrs. Hargreaves very deliberately avoided looking at the diary at all, fixing her gaze instead on a slightly crooked landscape painting. Craddock closed the heavy volume with a decisive snap. Until we identify the wrong heir and the true child, we're working in the dark. But one thing seems clear. Whoever benefited from that long-ago injustice had every reason to fear Miss Blacklock's determination to set the record straight. Unless, Miss Marple said softly, the danger came not from the past beneficiary, but from someone whose present comfort depends on that error never being corrected. Her seemingly idle observation hung in the air as the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, marking the passage of time since Miss Blacklock had raised her glass to truth. No, Lord, in St. Mary Mead, truth was rarely welcome when it threatened to rearrange the careful hierarchies and quiet compromises that made village life tolerable. And somewhere among the neatly dressed figures in that room sat a person for whom truth was not merely unwelcome, but deadly. Sylvia remained with Inspector Craddock for some time. The hum of low voices from the study filtered into the drawing room, punctuated now and again by sharper phrases that carried further than they were meant to. "I don't see how my parentage could possibly concern this investigation." Sylvia's usually composed voice rose faintly. "I came here to help my uncle, not to be interrogated about events that occurred before I was born." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. It was not so much the protest itself as the choice of words that interested her. "Before I was born." A curious emphasis, as if Sylvia were used to defending a point that had been challenged often. When the young woman finally emerged, she looked pale but composed, her eyes glittering with an inner resolve that did not match her fragile appearance. The vicar moved toward her with concern. "My dear, I hope that wasn't too trying. Inspector Craddock can be thorough. It was merely intrusive," Sylvia replied, managing a small smile. "Apparently my father's unfortunate history remains of great interest." Her tone held a faint, almost imperceptible bitterness. Miss Marple heard in it the echo of a child who had grown up in the long shadow of someone else's disgrace. Craddock followed shortly after, expression thoughtful. He held a single sheet of notepaper torn from his book. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, drawing aside near her chair, "you have a better memory for village history than anyone. Does the name Edward Lane signify anything to you? He would have been in his 20s at the time in question, connected to the church somehow." Miss Marple's face arranged itself into lines of mild concentration. "Edward Lane? Why, yes. He was the vicar's younger brother, a charming young man, but with rather elastic notions about money that wasn't his. There was some unpleasantness about charity funds, gone astray. He married in a hurry. I remember that quite well. The family went away soon after." "To London," Craddock confirmed, "and according to Miss Sylvia, he died when she was very young. Miss Blacklock mentions the name Lane several times in her more recent pages, always in connection with the phrase, wrongful beneficiary." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I recall another thing, Inspector. Around that time there was a considerable inheritance from a Miss Pritchard, no relation to me, of course, though people often assumed so. A wealthy spinster who left everything to a relative in London. There was gossip at the time, gossip that the wrong child might have been named in the will. But it was all very vague and soon overshadowed by Mr. Edward Lane's departure." Craddock's gaze sharpened. "A disputed inheritance. A child. Miss Blacklock digging into old records. And now a murder. It begins to form a pattern." "Patterns," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "have a way of repeating themselves in human life. A person who benefits from one injustice is sometimes tempted to commit another in order to preserve that first advantage." As they spoke, an undercurrent of tension swept through the room. The constable stationed at the door had been allowing people to leave in 2s and 3s once their statements were taken, but not everyone was eager to depart. Mrs. Hargreaves seemed particularly reluctant, hovering near the sideboard with an air of someone waiting for something that had not yet occurred. That something presented itself in the form of a small, hesitant figure at the doorway, Mabel, the Hargreaves' parlour-maid, twisting her cap between nervous fingers. She must have slipped past the constable while he was engaged with another villager. Her eyes sought out Miss Marple with unmistakable desperation. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," she said in a low, hurried voice, "but I thought, well, you always do seem to understand things. And I don't like to see wrong done, I don't. Not after what I heard Miss Blacklock say to the mistress yesterday. Every ear within range sharpened at once, though most faces continued to pretend indifference. Miss Marple's eyes softened kindly. "Come and sit down, my dear. No one ever did any harm by telling the truth. Though, to be sure, it's sometimes uncomfortable in the doing." Mabel perched on the very edge of a chair, clutching her cap. "It was about that great diary, ma'am. Miss Blacklock came to the house unexpected-like. She said to the mistress, 'You've lived with this lie long enough, Agnes. It's time the real heir knew what was stolen from them.' And the mistress, she went quite white and said, 'If you print a word of that filthy slander, I'll—' Mabel broke off, glancing fearfully toward this odd Mrs. Hargreaves, who had gone rigid. "You'll what?" Inspector Craddock's voice cut in, sharper than before. She said, "I'll stop you one way or another." Mabel swallowed. And Miss Blacklock, she just looked at her and said, "You won't be able to, Agnes. It's all written down now." So Miss Marple's needles lay motionless in her lap. In her experience, threats spoken in the heat of long-suppressed fear were rarely idle. But fear alone did not make a murderer. That required something more, something deliberate. And as Mabel's trembling words hung in the air, Miss Marple was struck by the distinct, unsettling feeling that Miss Blacklock's diary was not the only record of that 20-year-old injustice still in existence. Night closed gently over St. Mary Mead, softening the sharp edges of the day's events, but doing nothing to quiet the anxious undercurrent that ran through the village. The fate had dissolved in subdued fragments, stalls abandoned, cakes half-eaten, bunting flapping over empty tables. The vicarage lawn, so recently alive with laughter and music, lay still under the pale wash of moonlight. Only the police remained, methodically concluding their work. Miss Marple accepted Colonel Bantry's offer of a lift back to her cottage, though she might easily have walked. The colonel, frowning, navigated the narrow lane with more care than usual. "Damned unpleasant business, this, Jane," he muttered. "Never liked Letitia particularly, but one doesn't like to see a woman poisoned at a church fete. Nasty, underhand way of doing things." "There are very few pleasant ways of committing murder, Arthur," Miss Marple said mildly. "But yes, poisoning is often the weapon of those who cannot face their victim directly. It requires a certain coldness." Dolly Bantry twisted round in her seat to look at her friend. "You think it's a woman, then, Jane?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands neatly over her reticule, "that we are dealing with someone who understands the workings of a village mind. Someone who knew that a public accusation from Miss Blacklock would ruin not only their own life, but several others. That kind of knowledge tends to accumulate more readily in women, who must often observe rather than act." At her cottage, lamps already lit by the faithful Florence, Miss Marple declined hot cocoa with a vague remark about being a little overtired. Once alone in her sitting room, however, she did not retire. Instead, she drew out a small notebook where she began to copy, from memory, the most salient details of Miss Blacklock's final diary entries as Inspector Craddock had read them. Aloud. "Wrong child," she murmured softly. "Inheritance. Photo. Proof. 20 years ago. A hasty marriage. A questionable legitimacy. And a wealthy spinster with a fondness for one particular infant. Yes, it does begin to arrange itself rather neatly, at least in theory." Her pen paused over the paper. One phrase Miss Blacklock had used echoed in her mind. "When the truth comes out, several innocent people will suffer." That, Miss Marple knew, was the heart of the matter. Murder was rarely committed to avoid punishment alone. Far more often it was done to prevent the ruin of those one loved, or believed one loved. She slept briefly and lightly, waking before dawn with the settled conviction that the photograph, not the diary, was the real key. If Miss Blacklock had indeed found photographic proof of her theory, she would not have entrusted it to a single hiding place. Women like Letitia Blacklock, Miss Marple knew, were rarely so foolish. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Inspector Craddock was seated somewhat stiffly in Miss Marple's chintz-covered armchair, accepting a cup of strong tea with more gratitude than he cared to show. The previous night had been a long one. "You believe there may be a second copy of the photograph?" he repeated, brow furrowed. "I should be most surprised if there were not," Miss Marple replied. "Think, Inspector." Miss Blacklock was threatening to expose a deception that had stood unchallenged for 20 years. She knew quite well that a mere accusation would not suffice. People do not destroy their own lives and those of others based on vague assertions. No, she would have made certain her evidence was both irrefutable and protected. Craddock frowned. "We searched her house thoroughly last night." Miss Marple smiled faintly. But did you search it as a woman who has lived alone for years might conceal things? Men, I have observed, look for locked boxes and hidden safes. Women favor sewing baskets, curtain linings, and the false bottoms of hat boxes. You should perhaps ask yourself where Miss Blacklock spent most of her solitary hours. People tend to hide things where they feel most themselves. Craddock hesitated. Her sitting room, perhaps? She did her correspondence there. Correspondence, yes, but also mending. I recall at the last parish meeting how she complained about her declining eyesight, making fine stitching difficult. And yet her gloves were always immaculate. Miss Marple's eyes grew distant with recollection. A woman like that would never throw away an old pair of gloves. She would unpick them, reuse the buttons, and perhaps, if she were very cautious, slip something thin and flat between the old leather and the new lining. Craddock straightened. You think the photograph may be hidden in a glove? It is a possibility worth investigating, Miss Marple said gently. At the very least, it gives us a more constructive occupation than simply waiting for our murderer to panic. Though I fear, she added almost as an afterthought, that the panicking may already have begun. For even as she spoke, a boy on a bicycle was pedaling furiously through the village toward the police station, his face white with shock. He had been delivering milk on the far side of Miss Blacklock's house when he'd noticed smoke seeping from the slightly ajar kitchen window. Not the thick black smoke of a house fire, but a strange acrid smell, and more ominously, the faint flicker of controlled flame. In Miss Blacklock's back garden, someone had lit a brazier and was feeding into it, one by one, small, flat objects that did not quite look like letters. They gleamed briefly before curling black at the edges, like photographs, Miss Marple would later think, being destroyed by someone who had finally decided that no evidence at all was safer than evidence hidden away. Jeremy's recovery was slow but steady. By late afternoon, Doctor, Haydock grudgingly allowed Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple a brief conversation, provided they did not agitate the boy. Jeremy lay propped against pillows in his small bedroom above the shop, a bandage around his head and a bruised, frightened look in his eyes. Didn't mean to cause trouble, Miss Marple," he began at once, his voice hoarse. "I only did what Miss Blacklock asked. It was just another job, like any other." Miss Marple settled herself in the lone chair, her knitting in her lap more for Jeremy's comfort than her own. "You did some copying work for Miss Blacklock recently, I understand," she said gently. "An old photograph." Jeremy nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "She brought me a studio portrait. Proper professional work. Must have been 20 years old at least. Said she wanted 3 copies, one for herself and 2 to give to, well, to the people it concerned." "And who were those people?" Craddock asked, leaning forward. "I don't know all their names," Jeremy admitted miserably. "She said one was for its rightful owner. Those were her words, and the other for someone who'd lied a long time. She looked hard when she said that." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And what exactly did the photograph show, Jeremy? Think carefully." "It was a family group, a lady holding a baby, christening gown and all that, and a man standing behind them, and another woman seated beside them, older, with a brooch like a bunch of grapes. Miss Blacklock said that brooch would settle any doubts." Miss Marple exchanged a swift glance with Craddock. "The Pritchard brooch," she murmured. "She was famous for it in the district. An heirloom." Jeremy licked his lips nervously. "Miss Blacklock was very particular. Told me to be careful with the faces. She came back the next day to collect the copies, but then, that evening, someone else came about it." "Someone else?" Craddock's tone sharpened. "Who?" "I'm not sure I ought to," Jeremy began, then looked at Miss Marple's kind, expectant face and gave in. "It was Mrs. Hargreaves. She came round just before closing, all in a state, asking if I'd made any copies of that old photograph for Miss Blacklock. When I said yes, she begged me not to tell anyone she'd asked. Said it was family business and that curious village boys didn't understand such things." "And did you show it to her?" Craddock demanded. Jeremy shook his head. "Couldn't. Miss Blacklock had already taken the copies. I only had the original negative left. Mrs. Hargreaves went white when I said I still had that. She offered me money to destroy it there and then. Proper notes, too." "What did you do?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I told her I'd think about it. After she left, I got frightened. Thought maybe I shouldn't have done the work at all. So I decided to give the negative back to Miss Blacklock and let her deal with it. I put it in an envelope ready for the morning." His gaze grew haunted. "When I went into the dark room today, the envelope was gone. And then, well, I didn't hear anyone come in, just a bang at the back of my head." Inspector Craddock straightened, his expression grim. "So, someone believed you still had the negative and was willing to assault you to find it. And now both the original photograph and its negative found missing." Miss Marple had not taken her eyes off Jeremy's troubled face. "Tell me, dear boy, this family in the photograph, the lady with the baby, did she resemble anyone you know now?" Jeremy hesitated. I thought the younger woman looked a bit like Miss Sylvia, only softer, perhaps. More country. When I said so to Miss Blacklock, she gave me a very sharp look and told me not to speculate." Miss Marple's hands, resting on her knitting, were perfectly still. "How very interesting," she said mildly. "Because Miss Sylvia, as we know, is the daughter of Mr. Edward Lane, and not officially related to Miss Pritchard at all." On their way back down the narrow stairs, Craddock spoke low. "This points squarely at the Hargreaves woman. She was terrified of that photograph, tried to bribe the boy, and now someone smashed his dark room." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "It does point at her rather too neatly, doesn't it? Just as the cyanide points so conveniently toward a young man who works with photographic chemicals." She paused on the landing, her pale eyes reflective. "In my experience, Inspector, murderers are rarely so obliging as to leave straight roads to their door. We must ask ourselves who benefits if suspicion falls on Mrs. Hargreaves, who has most to gain if she is discredited, and the truth about a certain young woman's parentage is never quietly, privately resolved." Outside, the village street went about its ordinary business, but an undercurrent of tension had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple felt it as keenly as the changing autumn air. Somewhere behind one of those neat brick fronts, someone held a stolen photograph, and with it, the proof that either a respectable matron or a charming young visitor was living under a false name. And she was increasingly inclined to believe that the truth, when it came, would surprise nearly everyone involved. Sylvia did not flinch at the sight of the handcuffs. If anything, a faint, ironic smile curved her lips, as though she had expected this moment and had been rehearsing her lines for it. "You are, of course, quite within your rights to suspect me, Inspector," she said coolly. "After all, I have the misfortune to be the late Edward Lane's daughter, arriving conveniently just as long-buried scandals resurface. But murder, poisoning a woman I barely knew at a church fete? Really, it's a trifle melodramatic, don't you think?" Inspector Craddock's voice remained even. "Jeremy identifies your voice as that of the person who attacked him. You had access to the Fair, to Miss Blacklock, and motive in abundance if that photograph proved you were not who you claimed to be." Sylvia's eyes flashed. On the contrary, Inspector, that photograph proves exactly who I am. Miss Blacklock herself told me so. The room seemed to tighten around her words. Miss Marple, who had returned to her chair with studied mildness, regarded the young woman with interest. Miss Blacklock told you something of that sort? She asked gently. In what context, my dear? Sylvia hesitated for the first time, then drew in a steadying breath. She came to see Uncle Clement the day before the fete. He was out on parish calls, so she found me instead. She said she'd been putting together pieces from years ago, that my father had been involved in some unfortunate misappropriations. Yes, but that one thing he had always insisted upon was that I was his acknowledged child. And the inheritance? Craddock prompted. She said Miss Pritchard had intended to leave everything to her godchild, Sylvia replied, her gaze unwavering. That's what the photograph shows, the Pritchard family with their godchild. Me. Jeremy stirred uneasily. But Miss Blacklock told me one of the copies was for the rightful owner, and the other for someone living a lie. That suggests two claimants, Miss Sylvia, not one. Sylvia turned on him with sudden intensity. You heard only fragments of a conversation you didn't understand, Mr. Potts. For all you know, the lie might refer to someone else entirely. Mrs. Hargreaves, for instance. The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Inspector Craddock's eyes narrowed. What do you mean by that? Sylvia relaxed fractionally, sensing the shift. I mean that Mrs. Hargreaves has taken a quite unhealthy interest in this photograph from the very beginning. She tried to bribe Jeremy to destroy the negative. She threatened Miss Blacklock. And if gossip in the village is to be believed, her tone turned pointed, she was very close to Miss Pritchard in her youth. Closer than a mere companion. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, sharply. She remembered the way Mrs. Hargreaves had said, I've been managing perfectly well for 20 years. Not way, but I. The pronoun choice had troubled her at the time, as such small slips so often did. Craddock was not entirely diverted. All very interesting, Miss Lane, but it does not explain why Jeremy heard your voice in the dark room this morning. Sylvia's smile returned, brittle but composed. Did he, though? He heard a whisper in a darkened room after being struck from behind. Hardly the most reliable witness, poor boy. And I dare say several ladies in this village share similar accents. Mrs. Hargreaves among them. Jeremy flushed, torn between certainty and doubt. I thought it was you, he stammered. But I suppose it was dark. Miss Marple cleared her throat very softly. Memory can be so very suggestible, especially after a blow to the head. People often fit what they think they ought to have heard into what they actually did hear. It can be most misleading. Sylvia seized upon this with evident relief. Exactly. And as for my motive, Inspector, if Miss Blacklock truly believed that photograph confirmed my identity, why would I wish to silence her? Mrs. Hargreaves, on the other hand, has far more to lose if anyone discovers she rearranged certain matters 20 years ago. Craddock looked unconvinced, but he lowered his hand from the handcuffs. You will not leave the village, Miss Lane. We'll verify every word you've said. Of course, Sylvia replied smoothly. I've no intention of going anywhere, not when my whole life here hangs in the balance. After she had gone, the room felt oddly emptier, though the tension remained. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. Well, do you believe her? Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft clicking a counterpoint to her measured words. I believe, she said slowly, that Miss Sylvia Lane has told us a number of truths arranged in a very particular order. The arrangement is most interesting. As to whether she is the murderer, well, Inspector, I think we shall know more once we have spoken with Mrs. Hargreaves again. People who have managed perfectly well for 20 years can react quite violently when they see their careful arrangements about to be disturbed. She glanced toward the window, where the twilight was beginning to gather over St. Mary Mead. Somewhere between Miss Blacklock's diary, the missing page, the christening photograph, and the Pritchard brooch, lay the key to the entire puzzle. And Miss Marple, who had seen many such puzzles in her time, sensed that one crucial piece was still hidden, deliberately perhaps, but not irretrievably. The days following Sylvia's arrest were thick with a peculiar kind of quiet, one that seemed to muffle even the usual village sounds. Conversations dropped as people approached one another in the high street. Curtains twitched more than usual, and everywhere Miss Marple walked, she could feel the weight of a shared, uneasy knowledge pressing upon St. Mary Mead. It wasn't merely that a murderess had been unmasked, nor that she had been living under their very noses disguised as a respectable clergyman's niece. It was the uncomfortable realization that beneath the surface of familiar lives lay a history of deceit, cowardice, and conveniently forgotten sins. Inspector Craddock, recognizing that the village would continue its own, less structured investigation if left untended, suggested a more formal explanation. Thus, 2 days after Sylvia's arrest, several of those most closely involved found themselves gathered in the vicarage drawing room once more. Mr. and Mrs. Hargreaves, looking as though they had aged 10 years in as many days. Dr. Haydock, Jeremy, still pale but recovering, the vicar and his wife, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, and, in her usual wing chair with her knitting, Miss Marple. Craddock stood by the mantelpiece, Miss Blacklock's diary beside him. He glanced at Miss Marple, a silent invitation. She inclined her head, but her voice, when she began, was mild and unassuming, as though she were merely recounting a curious incident of village life, rather than laying bare the moral anatomy of a crime. You see, she said, her needles clicking gently. Once it became clear that a photograph lay at the heart of this business, the rest arranged itself rather naturally. Miss Blacklock was a methodical woman, with a deep sense of right and wrong. When she at last discovered that Miss Pritchard's fortune had not gone to the intended heir, she felt it her duty to put matters right. Mrs. Hargreaves gave a strangled sound. She had no right to pry into matters that were settled long ago. Were they settled? Miss Marple asked gently. Or merely concealed? You were Miss Pritchard's companion, Mrs. Hargreaves. You knew that when your illegitimate child arrived, it created a terrible difficulty. If the truth had come out, you might have lost both your position and your chance of marriage to Mr. Hargreaves. And when Miss Pritchard chose her godchild as heir, you saw an opportunity. Mr. Hargreaves stirred. Agnes, is this true? She did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the carpet. I did what I had to do. Your family needed that money. My child needed security. And so, Miss Marple continued quietly, the true godchild, Sylvia, as she was then, was sent away, her identity obscured. Your own child was passed off as the Pritchard heir, and when Miss Pritchard died, the inheritance followed. But Sylvia, the vicar began, clearly distressed. Not the same Sylvia, Miss Marple said. The real Sylvia Lane died in London years later. Our visitor discovered the truth among old letters and took her place. An impostor, yes, but one with a genuine claim to the money that had been stolen from her as an infant. Mrs. Hargreaves looked up at that, her eyes blazing. Stolen. I raised that child in comfort. I made sure she lacked for nothing. And yet, Miss Marple replied, she grew up in poverty, Mrs. Hargreaves. Not your child, the other one, the one who should have been here all along. That is the tragedy. 2 children wronged, one by being denied her inheritance, the other by being born into a lie. There was a heavy silence. Even Colonel Bantry, usually quick with a bluff remark, said nothing. Miss Blacklock, Inspector Craddock put in, had gathered enough evidence, letters, testimony from the midwife, and that christening photograph, to expose the entire arrangement. She meant to read portions of her diary publicly after her toast at the fete. That is why Sylvia poisoned her before she could speak, and why she attacked Jeremy, Miss Marple added. The negative represented a truth she could not alter. Desperate people do desperate things when their constructed identities are threatened. Jeremy shifted uneasily. She said it didn't belong to me. She sounded furious. Not mad exactly, but like someone who'd decided everything in the world had been unfair to her. Miss Marple nodded. Bitterness can be as dangerous as any weapon, my dear, especially when it is mixed with a sense of righteousness. Mrs. Hargreaves gave a silent whoop. If Letitia had only left it alone. No, Miss Marple said softly, but with unusual firmness. If you had only told the truth. These things, she added, her gaze encompassing the room, never really stay buried. They merely wait until the right, or wrong, person uncovers them. The vicar's wife dabbed at her eyes. What will become of the inheritance now? That, Craddock said, will be for the courts to decide. The Crown will prosecute Sylvia for murder. As for the Pritchard estate, there will be lengthy legal arguments. But whatever the law decides, the moral balance has been disclosed. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her expression remained thoughtful. There was still one final thread to tug before the pattern of motives and choices could be fully understood, and she had an idea of where to find it. For though Sylvia's crimes were clear, Miss Marple knew from long experience that murder never arose in isolation. It grew from soil prepared long before, watered by lies, cowardice, and self-deception. She intended, before the village settled back into its appearance of tranquility, to speak once more with Mrs. Hargreaves, alone. In the weeks that followed, Mary Mead did what English villages have always done in the wake of scandal and tragedy. It adjusted, not without protest, but with that curious mixture of resilience and selective memory that had long fascinated Miss Marple. People still shopped, still gossiped, still attended church, but there was a new caution in the way names were spoken and histories recalled, as though everyone had suddenly remembered that the past was not quite as tidy as they preferred to imagine. The legal machinery moved with the ponderous inevitability Miss Marple had come to expect. Sylvia, whose real name turned out to be Margaret Dean, was charged not only with the murder of Letitia Blacklock and the assault on Jeremy Potts, but also with various counts of fraud relating to her assumed identity. Her solicitor, a harassed man from London with tired eyes, attempted to cast her as a tragic figure driven to desperation by a lifetime of injustice. There was some truth in that, Miss Marple reflected, but not enough to outweigh the cold deliberation of her crimes. Agnes Hargreaves, after prolonged interviews with both Inspector Craddock and a very patient solicitor of her own, found herself facing the quieter, but no less devastating, consequences of her long-ago deception. While no one suggested she had physically participated in the murder, her confession ensured that the Pritchard estate would be the subject of intense legal scrutiny. Harold Hargreaves, who had spent around 2 decades believing himself a respectable gentleman of substance, now discovered that most of what he possessed might rightfully belong to another. The law, Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Bantry one afternoon over tea, is rather good at deciding who owns property. It is considerably less adept at deciding who owns guilt. The true heir, when finally identified, proved not to be Sylvia, Margaret Dean, after all, but a quiet, middle-aged woman in Leeds who had lived her entire life as Miss Clara Morrison, working as a schoolmistress and never suspecting that her godmother's fortune had been diverted to another. When informed of her unexpected inheritance, Clara had written a letter to the Hargreaves family that Miss Marple, through the complex social conduits of St. Mary Mead, eventually saw. "I cannot help thinking," Clara had written in a careful schoolmistress hand, "that if I had been allowed to know the truth sooner, much unhappiness might have been avoided. Still, I bear no personal malice toward you. I have lived a contented life without expectation of wealth. I hope that whatever is decided will allow us all to find some peace." It was, Miss Marple thought, an unusually generous response under the circumstances. But then, People deprived of something they never knew they possessed often bore the loss better than those who feared having it taken away. The village, of course, had its own judgments. Mrs. Price Ridley declared loudly that she had always suspected something was not quite right about those Hargreaves accounts. Mrs. Bantry, less theatrical but more perceptive, quietly wondered how many other families might be living upon foundations of similar unexamined assumptions. The vicar preached a sober sermon on truth and its consequences, which was widely agreed to be very appropriate, though Miss Marple suspected that few of his congregants applied it too closely to their own lives. One crisp October afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned to St. Mary Mead, ostensibly to finalize some paperwork, though Miss Marple suspected he also wanted the comfort of a particular brand of moral clarity. They walked together in her small garden, where the last roses clung bravely to their stems. "You were right from the beginning," he said at last, "about it all hinging on identity. I've worked any number of cases involving stolen money, disputed wills, false testimonies, but I've rarely seen one where the central theft was of a life itself." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People will do dreadful things for money, Inspector, but they will do far worse when they believe someone has stolen who they are supposed to be. That poor girl, Margaret, began as a victim of injustice. It's rather tragic that in trying to reclaim what she thought was hers, she became the perpetrator of something far worse." Craddock considered this in silence for a moment. "Do you think she saw it that way, in the end?" "In my experience," Miss Marple replied, trimming a dead blossom with neat precision, "people who have lived lies for a very long time often become quite adept at believing them. It makes their actions easier to bear. But the truth has a way of asserting itself, even if only in those quiet moments just before sleep when one cannot quite avoid remembering what one has done." He looked at her thoughtfully. "And Agnes Hargreaves?" "A coward," Miss Marple said gently, "but not an uncommon one. Most wickedness, I have found, is not committed by villains twirling their mustaches, but by ordinary people who lack the courage to face the consequences of their mistakes. Agnes chose deception when honesty became too difficult. Margaret chose murder when legal redress seemed impossible. Both were wrong, of course, but one can see how they arrived there. They walked in companionable silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of village life, children playing, a dog barking, the faint chime of the church clock marking Key was the hour. Life went on, as it always did, absorbing even the most shocking events into its steady progression. "And Miss Blacklock?" Craddock asked at last. "She died trying to set things right." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "She represents the third possibility, you see. Some people, when they discover an old wrong, will risk quite a lot to correct it. Perhaps she was overzealous. Perhaps she failed to understand how dangerous truth can be when people have built entire lives upon a lie. But there is something admirable, I think, in her determination that the record be set straight." Craddock gave a wry smile. "You make it all sound like a moral parable, Miss Marple." "In a village," she replied serenely, "everything is a moral parable if one has the patience to observe it. Human nature does not change very much, whether it's played out in drawing rooms or at harvest fetes." When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, where the late afternoon light fell across the small table that now held a familiar object. Miss Blacklock's great leather-bound diary, returned by the authorities after its evidentiary value had been exhausted. Craddock had arranged it quietly. He knew, as she did, that no one was better suited than Jane Marple to serve as a custodian of such a chronicle of village life. She opened it at random, skimming an entry about the price of eggs and the vicar's new sermon series. Even in these mundane observations, she could see the subtle threads of human nature woven through. Resentments, vanities, small acts of kindness and cruelty. 500 pages of it, in fact. More than enough, as she had thought that first afternoon, to get someone killed. Yet, as she closed the book and set it gently aside, Miss Marple reflected that, while such records could indeed be dangerous, They could also serve a different purpose, as reminders that truth, however painful, was always preferable to the kind of festering deception that had destroyed the Hargreaves family and turned Margaret Dean into a murderer. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued its eternal business of living, gossiping, and quietly forgetting. Inside her neat little cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her pale blue eyes thoughtful but serene. There would be other crimes, other secrets, other tangled threads of human folly to unravel. For the moment, however, the village was safe enough, its latest tragedy having run its course. And Jane Marple, who understood better than most how fragile the appearance of respectability could be, sat quietly among her roses and her memories, reflecting, as she so often did, that the most dangerous mysteries were rarely those written in diaries or hidden in photographs, but those written in the hearts of seemingly ordinary people. Autumn advanced quietly over St. Mary Mead, softening the harsh outlines of the recent tragedy. Leaves turned and fell, gardens were put to bed, and the village, being a village, began, as villages always do, to absorb even murder into the fabric of its everyday narrative. Yet under the outward return to normality, Miss Marple sensed subtle but lasting changes, like fine cracks spreading through old china. Jeremy Potts returned gradually to his duties at the grocer's, though the boy's usual cheer had acquired a certain gravity. People treated him gently now. Too gently, Miss Marple thought, with that half-conscious air of indulgence reserved for those who have seen too much and are therefore excused from her ordinary expectations. When he came one afternoon to deliver her groceries, he lingered awkwardly at the door. "Miss Marple," he began, twisting his cap between nervous fingers. "Do you ever think, if I'd burned that negative like Mrs. Hargreaves asked, Miss Blacklock might still be alive?" Miss Marple invited him in and settled him with tea, as she did anyone troubled by questions they barely dared to articulate. "My dear boy," she said gently, "if you had burned it, the truth would still have existed. That is the difficulty with truth, you know. It does not cease to be simply because we close our eyes to it. It only becomes more dangerous." "But it set everything off," Jeremy persisted. "The diary, the photograph, that woman coming here under a false name, those things were already there," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "Lies and injustices do not spring fully formed from a single act. They accumulate like dust in a room no one has bothered to clean. You did your duty as a professional. It was others who chose to turn truth into a weapon." He seemed to find some comfort in that, though she noted he left his cap behind, a small absent-mindedness that spoke of lingering disturbance. She hung it carefully by the door, knowing he would return for it, as people always returned for pieces of themselves left behind in times of distress. News traveled that Agnes Hargreaves had been moved to a quiet nursing home some miles away, where her mental and physical health could be monitored. Harold visited faithfully at first, traveling twice weekly with the doggedness of a man clinging to the last intact fragment of his former life. But even from a distance, Miss Marple sensed that something in him had altered irrevocably. The revelation that his entire marriage, and indeed his whole social and financial standing, had been built upon deception had shaken the very foundations of his personality. Miss Bantry, relating the latest gossip over tea, summed it up succinctly. "He looks like a man who's discovered his house was built on a swamp, Jane. Doesn't quite dare step anywhere for fear it will all sink beneath him." The trial, when it came, was swift and sensational, even for those accustomed to the dramatics of assize courts. Sylvia, whose real name, it emerged, was Margaret Dean, conducted herself with a composure that unnerved even experienced observers. She made no attempt to deny the facts, merely couched them in the language of long-denied justice and righteous anger. It swayed some in the public gallery, Miss Marple noted, but not the jury. After the guilty verdict was delivered, Inspector Craddock visited Miss Marple once more, bringing with him the final pieces of official closure. "Dean received the expected sentence," he said soberly. "Her counsel attempted to argue diminished responsibility, but the planning was too thorough. the execution too precise. The jury saw it for what it was. "And Mrs. Hargreaves?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Too ill to stand trial at present. There may be proceedings later regarding the fraud, but between her health and the decades that have passed, I suspect mercy will play a significant part in whatever judgment is rendered." They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the faint sounds of village life outside. The rattle of a milk cart, the distant shouts of children playing. The church clock marking the passage of another unremarkable afternoon in a village where the remarkable had so recently occurred. "You know," Craddock said at last, "what stays with me about this case isn't the poison or the diary or even the photograph. It's that letter you found in the diary cover. If Sylvia had just waited, spoken honestly to Miss Blacklock, trusted someone, she might have had everything she wanted." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet precision. "That is often the way of it, Inspector. People commit their greatest sins at the very moment when patience and honesty would have given them what they sought without bloodshed. They choose the darkest path precisely when the light is within reach." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you ever tire of seeing it so clearly, Miss Marple? Human nature, I mean, all its worst corners." She smiled faintly. "On the contrary, I find it oddly reassuring. People are much the same everywhere, you know. St. Mary Mead, London, the West Indies. Their virtues and their vices differ only in degree, not in kind. And just as there is cruelty and deceit, there is also kindness and courage. Jeremy refusing the bribe. Miss Blacklock risking scandal to right an old wrong. Even Harold Hargreaves, in his own limited way, trying now to do what is decent for his wife." Craddock rose to leave, tucking his notebook into his pocket. "Well, I'm grateful you're here to see it all for us. The village may not always appreciate what you do, Miss Marple, but I do." "Not what I do, Inspector," she corrected gently, walking him to the door. "Merely what I notice. The world writes its own stories. I simply read them." When he had gone, and the quiet of early evening settled over the cottage, Miss Marple put aside her knitting and opened her own small notebook. In neat, compact handwriting, she added a new entry to the long list of cases that had passed through her observant life. St. Mary Mead, the 500-page diary, poison at fate, old fraud, false heir, real victim. Conclusion: secrets ferment, truth delayed grows poisonous, human nature constant. Closing the book, she looked out at the village she knew so well, its cottages, its gardens, its ordinary comings and goings. Somewhere, even now, new secrets were being born, small deceits taking their first tentative steps toward becoming large ones. She could not prevent that. No one could. But she could, when called upon, help ensure that when those secrets finally rose to the surface, the cost in human suffering might be made a little less. And that, she reflected as she turned to prepare her evening tea, was all that any one person, however observant, could reasonably hope to do. Winter settled gently over St. Mary Mead, softening sharp edges and laying a thin, clean veil over roofs and hedgerows, as if the village itself wished to forget the uglier parts of recent months. Yet inside the cottages and along the lanes, memory persisted, as it always did, with that particular tenacity found in small communities where nothing was ever truly forgotten, only spoken of more quietly. Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with a fresh length of soft blue wool, had the air of someone whose mind had wandered far beyond the peaceful confines of her sitting room. The 500-page diary, now returned by Inspector Craddock after the trial, lay on a nearby table, not as an exhibit in a crime, but as a relic of a woman whose intentions had been fatally misunderstood. Dolly Bantry called one afternoon, bringing with her a brisk flurry of old air, gossip, and the faint smell of snow from her fur collar. She settled herself without invitation, as was her custom, and regarded Miss Marple with that frank curiosity which never quite dulled. "It's extraordinary, Dolly began. "How people have already begun to reshape the whole business to suit their own ideas. I heard Mrs. Price Ridley declaring that she had always suspected Miss Blacklock was meddling in things best left alone. And poor Agnes. Well, half the village thinks she's a monster, and the other half thinks she's a martyr to circumstance." Miss Marple's needles clicked on. "People prefer tidy stories, dear. Villains and victims neatly separated. They find it troubling when both inhabit the same person." Dolly shivered, though the fire burned brightly. "And what do you make of it all, Jane? Now it's done. Was Sylvia entirely wicked? Agnes entirely to blame? Or was it one of those dreadful mixtures you always seem to find?" Miss Marple considered this, her eyes on the dancing flames. "I think," she said slowly, "that Sylvia began as a victim and made herself into a villain, whereas Agnes began as a selfish woman and allowed her selfishness to curdle into cowardice. Each had opportunities to choose differently. That, to my mind, is where true guilt lies, in the choices repeatedly made." She picked up Miss Blacklock's diary, letting it fall open somewhere near the middle. The pages, dense with that small, precise hand, spoke of garden competitions, choir practices, the vicar's sermons, weather observations, births, illnesses, and acts of quiet charity. Tucked amongst these were the more serious entries. The Pritchard affair described not with glee, but with sorrow. "You see here," Miss Marple said, turning the book so Dolly could glimpse the lines. "Letitia did what very few people ever truly do. She acknowledged that an old wrong had been done and felt personally responsible to help set it right, even though she had not caused it. Most people, when confronted with others' misfortunes, prefer to say, 'It's none of my business.' Letitia, for all her fussiness, refused to say that, and died for it," Dolly said somberly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but I think, had she known the outcome, she might still have chosen the same path. There are people like that, you know, quietly brave. Not dramatic like heroines in novels, but steady in a way that frightens those whose lives are built on lies." Later that week, the vicar called with a formal letter from the solicitors handling the Pritchard estate. The true heir, distant, bewildered, and almost embarrassed by his sudden change of circumstances, had written to express thanks for Miss Marple's role in bringing the truth to light, though she had never met him and hoped she never would. "The world," she told the vicar gently, after he had read the polite, awkward gratitude aloud, "has a way of straightening itself eventually, like badly knitted wool unraveled and done again properly. It is seldom pleasant and almost never quick, but it does happen." "And the village?" he asked. "Oh, Merry Mead will go on, much as it always has," Miss Marple said. "People will gossip, take their small moral stands, forget what is inconvenient to remember, and remember very clearly what suits them. But perhaps," she added, "perhaps there will be one or two who will think twice before saying, 'It's none of my concern,' when they glimpse a wrong being done." That evening, as snow began to fall in earnest, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting and the quiet tick of the clock. The diary rested on the table beside her, not as a monument to murder, but as a testament to observation of days, of people, of choices. 500 pages, she reflected, to record the life of a village. Enough to reveal that evil seldom appears in the form of a stranger in a dark lane. Far more often, it wears the familiar faces of fear, pride, and long-nursed resentment, and sometimes, tragically, the face of justice twisted out of shape. She threaded her wool, set another row, and thought, as she often did, that the great mystery was never how a particular crime was committed, but why human beings, with every opportunity to choose kindness, so often chose otherwise. Outside, the village settled toward sleep, its secrets, old and new, buried for the moment beneath a clean white veil.